Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Pielka. Today is September 22, 2024. Want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. Also, want to thank John Else for introducing me to part two with Mark Danner. Thank you so much, Mark. Where in the heck you calling in from?
My pleasure, Jerry. I'm in Berkeley, Grizzly Peak Boulevard in Berkeley, California.
How cool is that? Reviewing part one was so fruitful for me. I really appreciated that.
Great.
So, to start off, Mark, I was wondering what was the tipping point? And I don't know if you prefer the word reporter or journalist, but you talked about your dad telling stories. You're a reader. You grew up appreciating and loving books through great parents. Where was that tipping point where you said, "Oh, I think reporting or journalism is my calling"? I mean, you are also an author, so you could say writing, but you sort of get the gist of it. Where's that tipping point where you go, "Oh, I can do that"?
Well, gosh, I don't know whether I've reached the tipping point yet, to tell you the truth. Um, it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
Uh, I I graduated from college and I got a job on the staff of the New York Review of Books. And
Yeah.
that was just a great job. It was working with authors, correcting galleys, uh, working as an assistant to the founding editor of the New York Review, Robert B. Silvers. And he would essentially rewrite pieces, and my job would be to type them up, to look at his pencil scratchings and retype the manuscripts. And it was a great lesson in writing, what writing was, what it wasn't. And all day long, I was in contact with writers working on their manuscripts, sending them books, sending them galleys. So it's kind of like being in the manufacturing site of a major publication in the United States. And I think that started to convince me that I really could do this. I was on my high school newspaper, which was an award-winning newspaper. It won the best in the state when I was a senior, the best in New York. And so I'd written before, but to actually think of doing it professionally, I think the New York Review of Books was really critical. And that work with Robert Silvers, who was really a critical mentor to me. And he's gone now. I'm very sorry to say. He was extremely important figure in American arts and letters.
Yeah, to the point where Marty Scorsese made a doc about him, and he's very important. But I'm
Right.
even asking Mark pre your high school newspaper writing. Where's that tipping point? Like you're in grade school. Are you going, "Oh, I'm reading the newspaper. I want to do this"? Where's that just to go into your high school journalism sensibility?
Uh, that's a good question. I knew that I wrote pretty well in grammar school. I got good grades. I was kind of a cut up. I got in trouble a lot and would get sent to the cloakroom and kept in detention and all the rest of it. But I knew that I could write well. I wrote in class well, and I always thought that I got that from my mother, who was a writer. She would write for local uh, stage productions, and she would do her own musicals and things like that. And I always thought that I kind of got that ability from her. I always took it for granted. But the reporting thing really came in high school and working on that high school newspaper. And it was just a lot of fun. We got in all kinds of trouble. We published an ad for a grass mask from a local head shop in the high school newspaper, and that got us in trouble with the school board. We did a double truck 2-page special on sex education in the high school, which also got us in big trouble. The school board had a couple of staunch Catholic members who raised hell about that. Um, so it was a way to uh, have a kind of freedom and raise a little bit of hell. It was really a lot of fun. And my co-editor in that high school newspaper, Sam Weinberg, who's now a professor at Stanford, he was critical as well because we were real collaborators in doing that kind of reporting. I wasn't a reporter in college. I didn't join the Crimson or anything like that. Um, but I think, thought of myself as a writer, that I could do that fairly easily.
Let's go back to your mom. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Mark. Sam, listen, it's fun. I'm just caught up in this. You were caught up, fun, freedom, all the themes we're going to touch on, touch into. But do you think, I know it's kind of a stupid question, but do you think it's more your mom and dad's DNA or more the way they raised you in that actual being a writer?
Well, uh,
It's both, but I mean, just is there a little inclination? It's a little more the one or the other.
I don't know. I tend to would say in with you're asking the famous nature nurture question. I would say it's both. My
Yeah,
father was the great historian and intellectual. My mother was the writer, and I think I benefited very much, from both of them.
yeah,
My father's attention to history, his fascination with the history of warfare, with World War II, contemporary history, my mother's facility with writing popular stuff. I think both of those things really were critical, to tell you the truth.
yeah,
And then, once we started doing it in high school, especially, it just became a lot of fun. And
yeah,
then by the end of college, I think I knew I was kind of an intellectual, basically,
yeah,
that I was interested in philosophy and religion and sociology, in contemporary politics. I knew these were all areas that my interests as I grew older were broadening rather than narrowing,
yeah.
rather than concentrating on a particular subject that would lead to a career. I was interested in more and more things, which really led toward one of these general thought leader kind of magazines, which I ended up working for. And later I worked for the New York Review, then went to Harper's, then went to the New York Times Magazine, then the New Yorker. So, and the New Yorker was the first real, writing job. The others were editorial jobs with some writing. But the New Yorker, I was staff writer. So that was very much a writing job.
Really good, Mark. I appreciate how concise and articulate you are. How about the tipping point for being an educator? Where did that come in?
Well, that's a great question. I came to Berkeley because a call came out of the blue from Orville Schell, who had been a staff writer on the New Yorker as well, and who was then the new dean at the Graduate School of Journalism at Berkeley. And he just called up to offer me this job uh, teaching for a year at the Graduate School of Journalism. The job was partly funded by the Center for Human Rights at Berkeley. So it was very much a human rights job. I had, at that point, written about the massacre at El Mozote. I'd written a lot about Haiti. I was becoming known as a person who was very interested in human rights and writing about massacres and human rights violations. And at a time I was writing about Bosnia, actually, the Balkan Wars, he invited me to come to Berkeley. And I at first turned him down. And my girlfriend at the time, Catherine Lee, sort of heard me put the phone down and asked who it was. And I told her, and she said, "Are you crazy? Berkeley would be great. Why don't you pursue that?" So I really did, because of her. If she hadn't walked by the office at that moment and heard me saying goodbye, I never would have done it.
Wow.
But I came to Berkeley, and I was extremely nervous before the first class. Although I'd spoken a lot in public and given presentations to the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, the Institute of Humanities at NYU, various colleges and stuff. I mean, I'd done a fair amount of public events. Actually teaching a course, I had no idea what I was doing. I was quite nervous about it. And a funny thing happened. I found, first of all, my first class was called Wars, Coups, and Revolutions, writing about violence. And I discovered that I knew a lot of things. You know, you don't realize as you're traveling around writing and covering stories that you're learning a great deal. And I really discovered that I had learned a lot and I had a lot to say. And the second thing I discovered was I love being in a classroom. I love students' questions. I love trying to get a discussion underway. I loved reading and analyzing texts. It just came absolutely naturally to me. And it was also a way, and this is true right up to the present moment, a way to learn myself. I mean, the next course I gave was about violence and its political repercussions, and also economic inequality and its political repercussions. And I gave that course because I was extremely interested in the subject. That was the single reason why. And, you know, we talked about Chile, we talked about Congo. We had several countries that had been riven by violence, and we tried to trace where that violence came from through economic forces. And it was completely out of the blue. You know, I wasn't following anybody else's course schedule. I simply thought this is a problem that I really want to get to the bottom of. And I used the course to do that. And that really has been the model for my teaching ever since, that I would think, you know, I really want to read Faulkner. I really want to read Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah.
I really want to look at the present political landscape. And those desires would lead directly to teaching a course on that subject. And it's kind of a dream for me that you can do this, you know, that you can just say, I want to learn about Hemingway. I want to read all of Hemingway. I want to see his centrality as a modern writer. And I could give a course called Hemingway and His Progeny, you know, Writing Manhood. That's what the course was called, Hemingway and His Progeny. So it's kind of a dream come true to just say, this is what I want to learn this year, and to just be able to do it with a lot of smart young people. I mean, I should add here that about 10 years into, a few years into the Berkeley teaching, I started teaching at Bard College in upstate New York as well. And that place, I was teaching both foreign affairs and literature. And I later continued those two sides of my interests by becoming attached to the English department at Berkeley. So right now I have a double appointment at the Graduate School of Journalism and in the Department of English. And it's been a godsend to me. You know, I basically have just followed, I mean, I mentioned Faulkner, Hemingway, Cormac McCarthy, Samuel Beckett. I gave a course last semester on film noir, which was my first complete film course at the English department. Wonderful, you know, just a thrill watching all these films I hadn't seen in years and talking to these smart kids about them, you know. So I feel like it's not a different thing than writing, you know, it's all about learning. Really delving into subjects and really learning about them. And in a sense, I feel like this has been my whole life, you know, this kind of plunging in and learning, whether it's doing it to go to Haiti and write about Haiti, or go to Iraq and write about Iraq, or doing it because I'm giving a seminar on Samuel Beckett. And I just decided, you know, I love Beckett. I want to read all of his work systematically. Or I love Faulkner. I want to start at the beginning and read all of Faulkner. And it's just been really delightful. I mean, teaching is wonderful. I really come out of many of these classes and think, I can't believe they pay me for this. But the only downside of it is that it takes, at least me, it takes a long time and a lot of preparation. So I have to spend a lot of time. That's Truman Danner.
Truman, I saw you last time.
He's visiting the room with Alpine Danner. That's Alpine making noise. So I've really been lucky.
There's someone on Instagram called Probably Wrong About Everything.
Uh-oh. Wow. We got a theme going here.
He's reading. Okay, you have to let me finish this. One.
Truman, someday
Probably wrong about anything.
Well, Truman, I'll have you on my podcast.
Can I use the phone while you're
No,
there?
you can't.
Why not?
Come on, let me finish what I'm doing, please.
Oh, man!
We'll book a date for part 1 with Truman someday. But, that's what I caught in deeply in part 1, Mark, was your love of teaching. I mean, it came through so thoroughly and deep.
Oh, great.
And the other theme I loved was laughter, family, and making the world a better place. Those 3 themes that came out. And I'm curious because a screenwriting teacher told me great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker.
Yeah, Joyce says the same thing. You're up above it all.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what role does intention play in your creative process? I mean, it is in being a reporter, being an educator, and, your pursuits, your calling. What role does intention play?
Well, wow, I think that's a very difficult question. Generally when you start work on something, you only really have a subject. And subject is a very broad term. You then get, you narrow things down. Truman, please do what I ask. Please let me finish doing this work. Go on.
Okay, jeez.
Bye. Right. See you next time, Truman.
So I think that intention only comes in, there's a vague intention when you say, Haiti is a great story. The Iraq War is the vital story of our time. I want to go write about it. But then you go through this interesting process, at least I do, when it comes to reporting, where you'll do all this work in preparation and you think you really know the story. And then because you read everything, you read background, you read a history of Iraq, you read all the coverage and so on. But then you arrive and you get hit by these unremitting volley of sense impressions, what the place looks like, what people are telling you, what the guy in the cab says, what people on the street say, what the smashed buildings say, bodies on the street, sirens, emergencies, riding around after a car bomb explosion. And, to me, you reach a point not very long after you get there where you don't know anything, where all of your certainty that came about because of the study at a distance is wiped away. And you begin building the story from the ground up through your current perceptions. And that is a kind of voluptuous pleasure of reporting. This notion of you've reached a point of ignorance. Because, of course, going to carry on with the Iraq example, people here in 2003, 2004 stop anybody on the street and they'd had very set views on Iraq, what a disaster it was, what a necessity it was, how well we were doing, how badly we were doing. Only when you get there do you become bewildered about the story. And that's when I think in the writing of it, that intention starts to play a part. That you only dig out the intention as you're writing, as you're working. The writing process, I find it so difficult because you're pulling the story out of the writing process. It's not like you go report, decide what you want to say, and then write it down. That isn't how it works, at least not for me. I go report and then start writing, and the intention comes out of the actual putting sentences together on the page, which is one of the reasons it's so hard to do. And I find writing very difficult, at least the first part of a piece. By the time I get to the second half, I'm usually thinking, why do I think this is so hard? Because I'm skating along. But the first part is usually quite difficult and strenuous because I'm never sure I'm quite getting it right.
That was good, Mark, because Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your reader when you're writing?
Well, I'm thinking of my reader, but if I do it too much, it feels like a constraint. Do you know what I mean? I think that, I often, when I'm having trouble, I often think, just feel like you're sending a letter to your father. Just feel like I remember once I was covering the Obama campaign, the first one in 2008, and I went to a rally in Philadelphia. And I came back, I was staying at the Ritz in Philadelphia. I don't know how I ended up in that hotel, but it was a beautiful place. And in the morning, I sat down at my computer and wrote an email to Robert Silvers, to my editor.
Yeah.
And I just basically described what had happened. And he, somewhat to my surprise, called me later and just said, we're gonna print this.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that, you're just writing a letter. You're just giving a report of what you saw.
And that is such great advice. That's a great advice because, usually writing teachers, creative writing teachers say, write what you know, or no, make stuff up. I mean, which is it? Make stuff up or write what you know?
Yeah. I think being a writing teacher has got to be a very hard thing to do. I mean, the times I've tried to help people write in my class, it's been difficult. It's not an easy thing to teach, I don't think. Yeah. But one piece of advice I would give is, and I think of this sometimes about giving presentations and speeches as well. You're just giving a talk and trying to explain, as you would to a friend,
yes,
what you saw,
yeah,
what you feel, what you're talking about Gaza. Well, you're trying to explain about Gaza to someone you know. And I think can often be good advice.
It's amazing because I know people who've attended Paul Schrader's writing courses, screenwriting courses at UCLA, and he'd say, okay, explain your outline for your film in 15 minutes to your friend and keep their attention for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, then once you do that, write the screenplay and then tell your friend the whole film in 90 minutes and keep their attention for 90 minutes.
That's that's great to hear. He's, of course, Schrader is just one of the great contemporary writers when it comes to screenplays. He's amazing.
Yeah, because we could go up on film for hours because he came out of Bresson and Ozu, and all his peers came out of John Ford, and it was like, whoops.
Well, Ford, of course, he Taxi Driver.
Yeah,
he thinks of as a rewrite of The Searchers.
Oh yeah, I know. He still comes out of Ford because he's in that realm of those other 5 main Searcher clones.
Yeah.
But here's the other one that really talk about childhood. When he was growing up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, being a hardcore whatever religion he was not allowed to see films. So
Wow.
you better be careful if you don't allow your kids to do TikTok, or because they may grow up and write Taxi Driver.
Exactly.
Whether
That's
that's a good
amazing.
or a bad thing, we think it's a good thing, but you have that challenge right now. How much do you restrict him from cell phones now?
Right.
And how much, but here's the other Duchamp I want to slip in. Duchamp said there's no solutions because there's no problems. Now that sounds mamby-pamby and maybe delusional, but since it's coming off of, there's no art without an audience, I just thought I'd slip it in because it really is something in your search. You say that so well. You get closer, when you get to I know nothing, once you get closer to your
Yeah.
subject, I know nothing, and then you're like, they want you as the reporter to say, well, what's the solution? And you said great in Bill Moyers, the op-ed culture we live in, like,
Right.
okay, end it with the solution. So any thoughts on just that Duchamp quote in general?
No, I
It,
think that's a wonderful quote. And I think
yeah,
the story about Schrader is brilliant too. I had
yeah,
no idea of that. He's
yeah,
just one of the great writers. Of course, First Reformed is a great example
yeah,
of
yeah,
coming back on religion. But there is a kind of therapeutic culture that op-ed takes part in. That journalism, in many quarters, since we have journalism that 24-hour cable, it needs to fill up these hours. I mean, it's
yeah,
really 8-hour cable, but it really needs to fill up all this time.
yeah,
And doing it, it's grouped. The questions are grouped around problems. How can we fix this? How can we do this? And around crises, the
yeah,
drug crisis, which,
yeah,
crisis is not a good word to describe what's happening with drugs, for example.
yeah,
That's a current situation that's gone on for 50 years.
yeah,
And, the great treatment of that is The Wire, right? Which shows David
yeah,
Simon's The Wire just
yeah,
shows that this is, they're guys who are distributing drugs, guys and women, and they're guys and women whose job it is to arrest them. And they do daily work, and it goes on, and careers go on and they end. And I think that's a really good lesson to learn. And Duchamp's quote is so wonderful because, we're not here to solve problems, to try to return the world to some hypothetical problemless state. That's a kind of artifact of liberalism, in a way, of progressive liberalism, that here we are, we're trying to perfect, we're about perfectionism. And that isn't really the way the world works at all. It goes along with the myth. John Gray has a great book about the myth of progress.
yeah,
This notion that we're progressing, that we're solving problems one after the other and becoming better and better and better and better. And
yeah,
he, in this book, will bring up World War II and the Holocaust and, the Rwandan genocide and the current war in Gaza and all of these things, which certainly contradict the notion that we're getting better and better and solving all these problems. We're not. And good writing is about confronting the world as it is, not this ameliorative project, which is to fix things. And I think early on in my writing, I became associated with so-called human rights reporting. I mean, I never really called myself that, but I was associated with that. This notion that, there's a massacre, you're going to write about it. And the implication is that by exposing it, it won't happen again.
yeah,
And I've never been convinced or even persuaded that that's the purpose of writing. And I actually to bring back the teaching theme, I tell my students this all the time, that if you judge your work by the change it makes in the world, you're going to go crazy.
Wow.
because that's simply a matter of luck. Only occasionally, like a story like Watergate,
Yeah.
do you have a journalistic project that actually contributes to real change in the world. I mean, obviously, the continual informing of the public contributes to a political reality that we all live in. But that's very different from saying that, your journalism changes the world and makes this huge difference and solves problems. I think, Auden was much more correct to paraphrase what he said about poetry, that poetry makes nothing happen.
Yeah.
I'd say writing makes nothing happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And Auden also said the mystery of art is that we don't know if it activates or pacifies us. And we don't know if
That's
pacifying,
brilliant.
yeah, but and it's sort of a rephrasing, but pacifying can lead to activating. So if you chill out, you might have an epiphany. But so much you brought up there leads to these questions I want to ask, Mark, and thank you. You're so articulate. The main one here is McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness. Like knife and a fork extends our teeth, shutter and a camera extends our eyelid, and maybe even non-tangible, say religion or philosophy, extends consciousness. What does the writing utensil extend for you? Whether it's a pen or a keyboard, what humanness does it extend?
I'd say curiosity,
Oh yeah.
curiosity and energy.
Yeah. And so let's just, and the other thing that you really evoked there was just before that was McLuhan saying understanding is not having a point of view. We think, oh, if I understand something, I'm for it or against it. No, understanding is getting the big picture, pattern. You recognize the patterns, then you get comprehensive awareness.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's why I think the artifact of liberalism is to protect the world. In fact, we were saying that laughter, family, and to try to make the world a better place. But are we real? That sounds good. I always say that. Well, we're all here to make the world a better place, but it sort of sounds mamby-pamby Hallmark cardish.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think it's very close to being a kind of jejune observation that's just like saying we're all trying to be good.
Yeah.
We're all trying to be good at heart. It doesn't bring much to the conversation. I
Right.
don't think. I think the extent to which your work makes the world better is a very indirect sense, very indirect.
Yeah.
Excuse me, they were driving me crazy.
Don't worry, Mark. I was going to apologize to you because part one, one thing I do is I take notes. So I'm not looking at you and people go, the dude isn't even paying attention. It's because I'm taking notes. But then there was a lot of chaos in my house that day. And I was like, oh man, should I apologize and say I'm sorry? We do have our lives to live. And actually, I love Truman's insistence right when I was saying, what does the pen extend? Like, what does the mask extend? What humanness,
I know.
That's totally heavy.
That's his Halloween. That's his Halloween mask.
Oh yeah, I mean the whole idea of humans inventing masks. And so let's just dive into this because you anticipated this question. John Basil Barnhill said, when the people fear the government, you have tyranny. Where the people fear the government, you have tyranny. Where the government fears the people, you have liberty. Then V for Vendetta in 2005 film paraphrased it. People should not be afraid of their governments. Government should be afraid of their people. So the questions around false fears, the 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 war on poverty, the war on terrorism, and then the one I usually give is the war on drugs. Well, you can't have You can't have a war on drugs because drugs don't fight, and you can't say no to drugs because drugs don't talk. But again, that's all
Very true.
metaphorical. That's actually a guy who worked for the US government said that. You probably know, I can't remember his name. But the question is, Mark, how do you personally handle false fears?
I think the important thing, obviously, is to recognize them as false,
Yeah,
and as to not let yourself fall into the use of those metaphors. I mean, the great business of the modern world is hype. It's hype. It's taking slogans, magnifying them, transforming our perception of the world into slogans which then are sold.
yeah,
And everywhere you look, you see this, the incredible hype. And war on drugs is a part of the hype machine.
yeah,
War on terror, that was a big chunk of the propaganda machine. And the problem is that the government, on the one hand, then the Bush administration, saw that as a very useful bit of propaganda. And the awful thing about it was the press did too. The press took it up and used it because it was a useful way to group all of their discourse about the current mega story, which was, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and make them into this big slogan, the war on terror, even though uh, terror is not an enemy. Terror is a thing that people do, a technique that's used in warfare. I always show my classes the Battle of Algiers, because it's the great movie about terrorism, about how you understand terrorism as one stage in a revolutionary, insurrectionary struggle. That it's not this singularly evil technique. As we're looking now at the Middle East, Hamas, the great terrorist organization, as we call it, that's the slogan. Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis or thereabouts. And the Israelis, in the time since, have killed, the official figure is 40,000 and counting Palestinians, but the number is probably 50 or 60,000 because of all the bodies under the rubble. Now, those people on both sides are just as dead. The idea that terrorism, the 1,200 killed by Hamas, were singularly evil, that act was singularly evil, and that the Israelis in the time since have been singularly righteous, is a dramatic moral misreading of facts in the world. So if you let yourself get swayed by these kinds of slogans, I think you kind of lose your humanity, which is, humanity is partly in recognizing that human beings count equally. That you kill a Palestinian, it's as bad as killing an Israeli, that these are killing people. And so we can let ourselves get overcome by slogans because they're everywhere. I mean, hype is it's also especially the great American profession. I mean, hype is the American art form, as far as I'm concerned. Hype, hype, hype. This is what we do. And so much of journalism has been given over to hype, I think.
Yeah.
I have to write about this specifically someday. But
Mark, I hope you do, because it's needed, because I want to add this. The humanity, you really answered the question about false fears. Recognize them as false and realize the loss of humanity that's involved in them, because that's why Joyce put in Buckley not shooting the Russian general in Finnegan's Wake, because he was taking a shit. He goes, I can't shoot you when you're shitting. That's like so why I profess that Finnegan's Wake is an anti-war manifesto. But here's what Jacques Ellul, really affected McLuhan by saying, hey, propaganda is just culture in action, to the point where Marshall says culture is our business, the name of one of his books. And he said, advertising is the cave art of the 20th century. So, when I study this, I realized that Poe invented the detective novel, which is
Mhm.
sex precede causes, reasoning backwards, and it affected the symbolists, the poets, Mallarmé, who said it doesn't matter what you say, it's the effect you want to produce.
Mhm.
That's why you don't buy a Tesla because you saw the ad. You buy a Tesla, and then the ad reinforces who you are, your identity, and then
Right.
it goes right to Obama when he hires Lakoff, says, "Help me get elected," and he goes, "Don't go for issues. That's what Democrats go for. Go for feelings. That's what Republicans go for.
Yeah.
Hope." Bingo. So I mean, this is like I wish you would uh talk about, or no, I would hope you could add that. Well, what is Jacques Well saying? Because you I know you're not demonizing hype, but you're saying, hype is the this, but like most of my friends, they hate advertising. It goes, advertising is one of the highest art forms. I don't like creating the disease and offering the cure. You have to have hand soap, or you have to have hand cream. But you know what I'm saying? There's a fine line between what Jacques Wells saying, propaganda is just culture and action, in a hype, or is there?
No, I think the danger is letting hype uh, dominate our moral ways of thinking.
I got it. Yeah.
I think, to think with moral intelligence
Yeah.
is the great challenge of living in this culture.
Yeah.
Uh, thinking, I mean, my example earlier was the Gaza war. To actually look at that and see it clearly is, I think, an enormous challenge
Yeah.
because of all these categories. And terrorism is the big one. That terrorism is this unique phenomenon that's uniquely evil. And once people descend to terrorism, they become worse than human. They become eminently killable.
Yeah.
That the fact that 1,200 Israelis are killed by terrorists lets the Israelis be morally right to kill 60,000 Palestinians. And, you know, I mean, this isn't a matter of numbers, it's a matter of innocent civilians versus combatants, essentially. And we have to remember those distinctions. And I think the challenge of hype and advertising is that it obliterates those distinctions in a kind of rain of slogans.
Yeah.
And those slogans are about opposing individual discrimination, about making decisions on your own, rather than taking preformed words, complex words,
Yeah.
and using those to dominate your moral thinking. I think that's the great challenge of living in our contemporary culture, particularly in the United States, because advertising here is so dominant. The jingles, if you watch cable news, you are just watching a huge amount of advertising.
Yeah.
And the jingles are just embedded in your life.
Yeah.
And news now is, the music, the slogans, the breaking news, all of the effects that Fox News has had on all of the other news channels, among other
Yeah.
things.
Well, Mark, this is perfect because I'm dying to hear your input. Does fake news more pacify or more activate? Now, I'll set it up first. We grew up with That Was the Week That Was in Mad Magazine. We didn't need to watch Rocky. We could just read it in a magazine and laugh at it.
This is true.
And then That Was the Week That Was anticipating, Harry Shearer's show, and then bingo, Jon Stewart, and now Colbert. I mean,
Mhm.
personally, I think Colbert is, He's funny. My wife loves him, but I can't. I think he's just empowering. He's not activating. And the same thing with PBS. Sheila Nevins hijacked the revolution because she could show the Weather Underground movie on PBS, and then all the yuppies like me go, "Wow, I don't have to do anything. They did something. How cool is that?"
Right. How satisfying.
Then one last thing is it's just whether it more activates or more pacifies. But the one is that gets me is there was an article just in the last couple months how Jon Stewart spawned Tucker Carlson, because Jon Stewart was the first one kind of where they gave him tons of money to report the news.
Right.
You talked about this in Bill Moyer's, like you don't put money in the news. It's like is it called Fairness Doctrine?
The Fairness Doctrine.
Yeah, it's right. Like I says, oh my God. And that's why Tucker became who he was, because of Jon Stewart. Because if he got a lot of money to do it on their side, well, why can't we? And the sad thing is Tucker Carlson's a deadhead. Ay, babe. So any thoughts on, does it more activate or more pacify?
Well, I think, one of the things you prove by your question is that ideology is not the consuming factor. You can have Jon Stewart being a predecessor for Tucker Carlson. The ideology doesn't matter. Yeah. It's that you're using the news as a springboard to entertainment, to mass entertainment.
Yeah.
And, that's what both of them have succeeded in doing.
Yeah.
Taking the news and making it into mass entertainment. I think, it's not either activate or pacify. There are elements of both. I mean, I would go back to these basic questions about emotions that certainly Alul talked about, and others in the kind of family tree that you described in your question. And George Lakoff, of course, is also very into this question of the emotions caused by different forms of communication. I mean, fear, for example, is the most lucrative emotion.
Yeah.
We're right now sitting through a campaign, an interesting example of two different campaigns where the governing emotion of the Trump-Vance campaign is fear.
Yeah.
And you're seeing how it does motivate, this idea that they're coming for your house, they're coming for your cities, they're coming for your pets, for God's sake. I mean, that is being drummed into audiences every day. I just attended a Trump rally in Las Vegas, and it's all about, he's extremely amusing. He's very funny to watch.
Yeah.
But it's all about the underlying emotion is fear and resentment.
Yeah.
And those emotions are very lucrative politically.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have this campaign on the Democratic side that also has a degree of fear in it. I mean, it says this is about joy. We're the joyful warriors, which I think is very smart.
That's
very
good.
smart thing to say. But in fact, there's a lot of fear. They're going to take away your birth control, just the way they took away abortions. They're going to take away democracy. That is all a fear-based argument. The Biden campaign was even more based on fear. It was even more based on Trump as a threat to democracy.
Yeah. So
I think fear as a kind of lucrative basic emotion that goes way back in the species, there we were naked on the savannah, worried about being hunted by large animals. And this is an activating emotion that you see being used right now in a very vivid way. So I think that's a question of, it seems to me, a kind of question of activation. And you saw, just to go back to the War on Terror example, that election in 2002, when Bush won seats in the midterms, in his first midterm, that election was all about fear. It was all about Osama bin Laden. And remember the guy, I forget, he was a senator in Georgia who lost, Democratic Georgian senator who lost, who had lost 3 limbs on the battlefield in Vietnam, and they put him up next to Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
And the Republicans defeated him purely out of fear.
Yeah.
So I think it's a question of looking at these different emotions and trying to see in these campaigns what they're trying to trigger exactly, what buttons they're trying to push through their advertisements, through their rallies, and so on. And insofar as we can do something as journalists, it's to expose those things. But of course, I'm writing now a piece for the New York Review on the Trump rally, and it'll be on a good day, it'll be read by 200,000 people, maybe.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a very elite segment of the population.
Yeah, the New Yorker had that great cartoon, which it ills me in a way, but it's 2 women in the gym and they go, I didn't protest this war, but I'm going to protest the next one. I'm like, oh my God, do I really have to read this?
Yeah,
because I love that you say it's both. It activates and pacifies us, because I know kids who watch Colbert and they go, I want to do something good. But you got what I'm saying, because this goes right back to your role as an educator, Mark. This is McLuhan in 57. It's misleading to suppose there's any basic difference between education and entertainment. The distinction merely relieves people of the responsibility of looking into the matter. It's like setting up the distinction between didactic and lyric poetry on the grounds that one teaches and the other one pleases. However, it's always been true that whatever pleases teaches more effectively. I might have even asked you this in part 1, but it's the whole thing. It's teaches more effectively. Does entertainment, what is the difference between education and entertainment? I mean, you're a good example. You could teach film noir and hardcore political historical journalism. I mean, that's a big range. So the question really is, what's the difference between education and entertainment? Whatever pleases teaches more effectively in both your realms, as a journalist and as an educator.
Well, I think teaching should be entertaining, obviously, when it's works best. I certainly agree with McLuhan about that, who is supposed to be a terrific teacher. I think that's absolutely true. On the other hand, there are differences between purely a show that's about entertainment. I mean, obviously, Jon Stewart, if you watch Jon Stewart regularly, you're going to have some grasp of contemporary events. You're learning about contemporary events. So there's an educational part in entertainment very, very often. But nonetheless, I think they are relatively distinct things. I mean, when I teach film noir, I'm hoping that they're not just watching these films, but they're learning about a particular era in American history. They're learning about how films are made. They're learning about how narrative works. They're learning something about the moral struggles that these films embody. They're learning about why those moral struggles fascinated a particular culture in the post-war era. What was the effect of the Second World War on the culture of the United States? Why the country started producing these films at this particular time? I mean, all of those things are what we discuss in class. And those, it's not as if at some future time they're going to be quizzed on this stuff, but you think that learning all of those things are going to help them become a better citizen and a more creative thinker. In other words, they're going to be able to think creatively and morally about things going on in the contemporary culture and things going on in their lives. Yeah. And so you're teaching not only a set of an infinite set of knowledge of things that you want them to learn, you're also teaching them how to use their mind in an aesthetic and moral way.
Yeah.
And you think about, let's give you a harder example between entertainment and education. How about going to an opera?
Yeah.
You go to an opera now, people would not tell you they're going to an opera for education. This is part of their entertainment. On the other hand, it's highbrow entertainment.
Oh, yeah.
And what does that mean? Does that mean that there's more educational value in it? Clearly going to see The Marriage of Figaro there's a high level of aesthetic pleasure in that, no question about it. But there is some degree of, no question, of education about the particular time, about that music. So I think this mixture isn't unusual. It's just the didactic arguments that people make about contemporary news, for example, tend to, by categories, separate two things that are really inextricable. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Mark, you're like, last time I said, I'm like talking to Harold Bloom. You go, oh, thank you. That's a compliment. Now it's like bringing in film noir. It's like I met and got to sit and talk with Sam Fuller once.
Oh, gosh.
What a guy. He's hardcore journalist. He's a war correspondent. And then he makes, think of film noir, Pick Up on South Street.
Yes, great film.
Pushes his grandmother down the steps. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah.
What is that going to teach
Richard Widmark.
Yeah, because that also one person says it's whatever teaches more effectively. And he goes, whatever displeases teaches more effectively. They flipped the question. I was like, no one ever said no, it's whatever displeases, because I don't like him pushing his grandmother down the chair, down the stairs in a wheelchair. But then it goes to Battle of Algiers again, because they ask Gilo, what does your film do for the audience? He says, it teaches them how to make a film. Now, that's amazing, because basically it's a fake documentary. There's one person in it who's an actor.
Right.
And it is, but they don't put it in the fake documentary section. They put it as a fiction film.
No, it's true. I never heard that quote from him. That's great. That's a great quotation.
Oh yeah, there's another.
I never met him. I was supposed to interview him at Telluride once, and he became ill and didn't attend.
Oh yeah. Anyways, there's a experience I had with Michael Apted 40 years ago. I said, why do rock video editors feel so obliged to edit fast? Most people don't know Abel Gance invented rapid montage in 1922, but it flourished in the 80s with MTV to the point where Marty Scorsese said, I cut my films faster because of MTV. So Michael said, because people have learned to take in information faster. I asked this with a bias. Can we literally learn to take in information faster, or are we just brainwashed to believe we can?
I tend more to the latter, that, I think the idea of taking it in faster. I mean, I have students who will, when they're behind in their reading, they'll get the Audible version of the book and they'll run it at double speed.
Yeah.
And that makes me crazy. The notion that you can do that effectively, I think, is just wrong. As I think multitasking in general, which students definitely more than the older generation believe in, I think is wrong. I think you can do two things at the same time relatively badly.
Yeah.
And I try with my children, I often tell them this, do one thing at a time. I'm always saying, pay attention to what you're doing. I think those things cannot be, I think the degree to which you concentrate and give your all to a certain intellectual or aesthetic task is the degree to which you are really taking in the information and consuming it so that it will stay there, rather than going through things very quickly. I mean, I'm amazed. I read the newspaper very quickly, a couple newspapers,
Yeah.
and I'm amazed the degree to which, the few days later, even though I read this really long piece in the paper, I don't remember it.
Yeah.
That you have to read it in a different way. And I see this in teaching sometimes, that if I spend a semester and read all of Faulkner, I won't necessarily remember the individual books as well as I would if I were reading them at leisure. It's different.
Well,
And
that's Joyce's advice in Finnegan's Wake. Remember to forget.
remember to forget. It's
But
brilliant. I love that you're quoting Finnegan's Wake.
Let me guess, the two Washington Post and New York Times. What are the two papers?
Yes, those are the two. And I also read The
Wow.
Guardian usually.
Right. Okay. Now, you have ESP, man, because the follow-up question is, can humans literally multitask? But this is the question I really want to ask, Mark, and you could answer that more. You addressed multitasking. TSA is tactile situation awareness. The Army dude's in the plane and he gets hit. He can't study all the gauges. He has to work on a comprehensive guessing game. Okay, what am I going to do to save my life? My friend said that's what kids are now, because you said we kind of multitasked or did two things at once when we were in college. Yeah, we'd smoke a joint, watch TV, and do our homework at the same time. but I mean, we know now it's like TikTok. I don't even have to explain it. Kids can do 5 things at once, where we did maybe 3, and you're trying to teach them do one thing good. And he says that's why this generation is going to survive or are better or whatever the value judgment is, because they're like TCA, tactile situation awareness. They're not identifying with one particular. I'm going to identify with my homework. I'm going to identify with the TV. I'm going to identify with the joint smoking. They're all of them. So they're getting a bigger picture, comprehensive. What's your take? I mean, on that idea?
Well, I think the premise of it, that kids are doing this, that their perception is being trained differently because of these different locuses or loci of attention. I agree with that. The question is it in some way better or worse?
Yeah.
And my view is that we're all about aesthetic and moral judgments are all about focus and bringing your whole body of attention to one phenomenon or to one task.
Yeah.
When you go to a museum, the great challenge is to see what's in front of your face. As Orwell said in another context, the great struggle is to see what's in front of your face. What is in that picture? And you go to museums nowadays and you see people, there's always a person who comes up to a painting, takes their phone, takes a picture of the painting, then looks at the placard that tells you the information, and then goes to the next one. Never looks at the picture. And the great challenge is to look at that picture, to see what it's depicting, not just in the narrative of what it's depicting, but everything it's depicting. What it's showing, what the different passages are, what particularly beautiful passages. Look how that flowing gown is being treated in this painting. Look how it's constructed. Or if you're looking at a Duchamp, what is the question? What are the things being challenged and asked in this work of art? What about the establishment of art in particular is this artist questioning? And do I think these questions are important? And what do I think the answers are to the questions he's asking? I mean, you need to come to grips with all of those things when you're looking at a Duchamp, for example. And it's all about, the idea of taking this in quickly and getting to the next painting is absolutely contrary to what the point of that aesthetic judgment is. Not just an aesthetic judgment, but an aesthetic experience,
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're failing to teach these kids, by giving them TikTok and these kind of videos. You're giving them these hits of dopamine, these constant hits of dopamine, and you don't even have to go to those. Look at contemporary movies. Go to a Marvel movie, and every 5 minutes or less, you get some kind of hit of dopamine, some kind of special effect. And instead of, the traditional plot was like this, right? It's an L on its side, all the way toward a climax and then a denouement. And these plots are they're like this, because they're all about giving the audience this kind of drug hit every few minutes or few seconds.
Well, I'm a victim. I'm a victim, Mark, because I grew up and appreciated Tarkovsky and Terrence Malick, and now I watch anything on YouTube horribly for 2 seconds. Go, okay, I have enough of that. Blah, blah, blah. I'm like out of there in 2 to 3 seconds. So is it like, and when YouTube started, I would not do it for 10 years because I knew it's like, oh no, this is trouble. And then once I got swooped into it, it just and it's hard for me to watch full films. Anyways,
see, I think that began with the remote control.
Oh well, that's funny because who said that? Peter Greenaway said the remote. Well, first of all, McLuhan said instant replay changed the world forever, and then remote control is Peter Greenaway. But I would
what
just
did Greenaway say?
Say it again.
What did Greenaway say?
Oh, we Google it, the remote control Peter Greenaway, and he said basically how the remote control changed us.
Yeah.
And he's the guy who, anyways, he's a Wakean too. But anyways, I would like to know, how much can I pay you to be my private tutor? I mean, this is unbelievable. So what's the difference between rights and responsibilities?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, to me, rights are those large spaces that our legal culture is constructing for human freedom. The right to individual prosperity, for example, which only some people have the right to. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. These things are rights that our legal regime is supposedly in some way providing for us. Responsibility is very different. I think you have a responsibility to yourself to flourish, to try to make yourself as varied and interesting a human being as possible. You have responsibilities to your children to make them as fulfilled and interesting and varied human beings as possible. I think, we have a human responsibility to make ourselves as sensitive and as morally acute as possible. I really believe that. That's one of the reasons it was so depressing to me around the time of the Iraq War, that not only was the government able to drum up all this support, I started to see these intellectuals who were friends of mine open their mouths and government propaganda would come out. And I thought, the entire business of doing what you're doing is not being prey to that kind of influence. And I was astonished. It's one of the reasons I started speaking out against the war, that I was astonished to hear all these people I respected, saying, not only supporting the war, but essentially parroting the government propaganda. We have a responsibility to have our own opinions that we arrive at, not through listening and parroting what the government says, but doing our own hard thinking and coming to our own conclusions. I mean, I always tell my students this, that your ignorance before a particular work, before you read this next book you're supposed to read, is the key thing, the key strength you bring to it. Your own ignorance, your own confrontation as a person, an individual person, with this work of art. So don't read the introduction. I'm not going to tell you ahead of time what to think about it. I want you to come up with your conclusion about what to think about it through this confrontation of the ignorant mind and this new work of art. You know, that's your moral responsibility, is to come to grips with it yourself.
Yeah.
Um,
Really well put again, Mark, because it evoked Maria Gimbutas, who we study a lot, who basically said matristic civilization, that humans are hardwired for cooperation, not war. Most people think, well, it's war and violence is in us naturally. And I'm like, well, Rianne Eisler respond from Maria, and she says partnership. And that's what's we're hardwired to be partners. So when you talk about it with Bill Moyers, a good war or a bad war, and people go, well, we needed to have that war. I mean, the great moment in my life, my dad got a Purple Heart in the World War II, and then my sister's an anti-war activist, and she says, will you babysit my kid when I go to an anti-war march? And he goes, yes. And to me, it was like, yeah, hey, I respect this. So what is the difference between rebellion and revolution?
Revolutions are, even though we use the word a lot, are very rare. Yeah. True revolutions. Revolution obviously means a turning completely around is the origin of the word. And nowadays, to have a true political revolution, it's very, very rare, in part because of automatic weapons. That if a regime is determined to stay in power and willing to do what it takes to stay in power and kill the number of people it needs to kill, it will stay in power.
Yeah.
Rebellions, on the other hand, are much more common. January 6th was a rebellion. It was a rebellion against what was perceived as the status quo. Yeah. And the great energy of Trump's movement is its rebellious nature, is the notion that it's rebelling against not only our contemporary politics, but our contemporary culture. Yeah. The enormous energy of the Republicans, the Trumpian Republicans, is this notion that they are rebelling against the larger political and cultural moment, that we're rebelling against what you see on TV. We're rebelling against who controls the government. We're rebelling against the way we think about sexuality and families. We're rebelling against all these things in the contemporary world that we don't like. So rebellion is a much broader, much more apposite word, I think, than revolution. Revolution's used a lot metaphorically. This was a revolution in how we thought about politics. But that's not a true revolution. Rebellions are much more prevalent, and they happen much more frequently. And we're experiencing one now. I mean, the Trump movement, in my opinion, is a rebellion. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, it's like when Trump got in, I says, can't we storm the castle? And then January 6th happened. I goes, wait a minute, that's backwards. And then when the Tea Party happened, Paul Krasner says, that's what we were doing. But he wasn't for it. It's like, uh-oh. But this is Utah Phillips, a great labor folk singing activist. Anarchy is making rules for yourself and not other people. Who's entitled to make the rules? Now, the word entitled there is problematic. I'm basically saying who should or who can or who will or who does make the rules. I mean, we know we live in a plutocracy. So you see what I'm trying to say. If he's saying anarchy is making rules for yourself and not other people, who is entitled to make the rules. That's the best verb. You can tell me if there's a better verb I could put in there.
Yeah, entitled is a complicated word,
Yeah.
obviously. Um, it's interesting that one could say, in answer to that question, who's entitled to make the rules, you could say less and less the people who traditionally have been. I mean, one of the things that's happening now is you're getting this anarchy of information.
Yeah.
The Trump movement is built on an undermining of the authority of information. The fact that, as you and I are speaking, there's this story about Springfield, Ohio, right? Home of the Simpsons, right? About Haitians eating pets. And even though this has been debunked, and when we say debunked, we mean that reporters have gone there and found that this is not happening. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that it's been debunked.
Yeah.
The story continues
Yeah.
because now, unlike X number of years ago when there were 3 networks and the New York Times, and you had these authoritative sources of news, that is all gone. Now those are just sources of news like other sources of news.
Yeah.
And among those stories is the QAnon conspiracy. Among those stories is all these other conspiracies, including about letting foreigners into this country, which is, of course, the big conspiracy that underlies the Trump campaign. So I think there's an enormous change in who gets to make the rules because of the pressure of free information, free and wrong information that has really, come about over the last 2 decades. It's a phenomenon of certainly of the internet, and it's had enormous political consequences. I mean, the Trump movement is really, it seems to me, a political consequence of that end of the authority of information.
And it's Goebbels repeat the lie and it becomes a truth. I mean,
absolutely.
That's it. I mean, this one could be a conspiracy, but if you look it up in Wikipedia, the 2 words conspiracy and theory were put together by the CIA, and my friend can show you the documents, to debunk JFK research. So then for years, the conspiracy theories weren't cookified. Now, if you say anything and it's conspiracy theory-ish, you're immediately like, that's a conspiracy theory. You're chalked off. And I always go, don't use the words conspiracy theory, use the word research. But then they'll go, well, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. So this goes to the exact etymology on the word freedom, Mark. Giving oneself one's own laws. Well, that's the same thing Utah Phillips said anarchy is, making rules for yourself and not other people. So the question is, what does freedom mean to you now? And I'll set it up with 2. T.S. Eliot. Freedom is only truly freedom when it appears against the background of an artificial limitation, which caused McLuhan to say, how are you to argue with people who insist on sticking their heads in the invisible teeth of technology, calling the whole thing freedom? Now that's great, because it's a question. How are you to argue with these people? What does freedom mean to you now?
Well, it's funny. It brings up the Marcuse. What's that essay? The dictatorial tolerance. About this notion of it's. I don't think that's the correct title, but it has tolerance in it.
Right, we can look it up. Yeah,
it's the notion that you are free because the society offers you all of these things you can do, and you're free to choose among them, that you are truly free.
Yeah.
And in fact, you're still choosing among this chosen panoply of activities and products and things that are supposed to supposedly enrich your life. But there's a great deal of it that is fake, right?
Yeah.
It's these things that are made for you to spend your time laboring
Yeah.
to purchase, and that's what Marcuse was trying to say, and I certainly agree with him about that. I mean,
Yeah.
freedom. I would connect freedom with moral experience. You know, with the ability to enrich yourself morally,
Yeah.
to feel a greater richness in your life when it comes to moral, aesthetic experience, friendship, love. Those are, and that's an essentially private idea of freedom. But I think you could extend that and say a society that does that, that helps do that for individuals, is a society that's free,
Yeah.
that promotes moral growth among its members, that promotes aesthetic experience, that promotes a broadening and a widening of moral points of view. That, I mean, I suppose you could introduce a liberal idea of amelioration, but I think once you get into that, you've perhaps spoiled the notion of freedom, because you're already going down the path of, as long as you make things better, the society is better, which I'm not sure is true at all. I think that's
Yeah.
kind of part of John Gray's myth of progress, which we referred to originally.
Yeah. Well, Mark, we got about 10 more minutes. I really appreciate your time and energy, and I sure hope we can plan a part 3, because again, we didn't get through all the questions, and I don't think we'll ever get through.
Well, they're very good questions.
Well, I appreciate it.
I especially appreciate the Finnegan's Wake references.
Oh God, we could do a whole thing on Joyce. I've been doing, yeah. So here's the Baudelaire. The basic question is archiving more innate or more invented, and do you have plans for your own archive? But we can go off a little, because the setup includes a lot. Charles Baudelaire says, if you try to make a statement long, deep, and rich, it will age very fast. If you try to only own the day you're talking, it will last forever. So,
Huh.
you know, David Lee Roth nailed it. He said, here today, gone later today. But it's basically, we come from this sensibility of be here now. Ram Dass, live in the moment. I felt for our 90 minutes together today, we were both very present. But the word archive, 1400s, means to keep safe, free from harm. Then 200 years later, it's what we pretty much know it as, a record preserved as evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, the Egyptians would keep stuff in their coffin with them. And Wyndham Lewis, I think, nailed it in that Eastern philosophy sort of way. Artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the future. But I also like the futurists saying, burn all the libraries and museums. I don't want that to happen, but you've got all those books in back of you. You've got a huge archives of all your writings, and they're important. And I imagine with your status in the world of journalism, you probably already have a college or an archive that's going to preserve your stuff. Do you have plans for your own archive? And is this need or want to archive more innate or more invented?
Boy, those are two obviously very distinct questions. The first one, my own papers and stuff are supposed to go to the New York Public Library. That arrangement was made way back when I was at the New Yorker, because they have the New Yorker collection there. And whether they will eventually go there or not, I don't know. It'll have to be a matter of whether, you know, they follow up on it. But that's where it's supposed to go. My own work. Our need, you know, I think let me approach this from a different direction. I think early on in life, when you're a young reader and writer, you think of your mind, or at least I thought of my mind, as like a bucket. You are filling up this bucket. And, you know, God, I haven't read Middlemarch. How embarrassing. I have to read Middlemarch.
Yeah.
You know, you would think of all these works that you're not familiar with and need to read. That's how I used to think of things. I
Yeah.
haven't read Light in August. How could I not have read Light in August? You know, I have to throw that into the bucket.
Yeah.
But as I've gotten older, I've thought of these things much more as experiences rather
Yeah.
than as things that you gather together. Because you know, memory is so frail, and you feel like one of the things you're doing, I feel like I've used this phrase so often in this conversation, but you're building a kind of moral sensibility
Yeah.
when you're reading Light in August. You know, you're asking yourself these questions about what the relations between the races are about, how we reached our present pass in American history, given the history of the South. All the questions that book raises, you're confronting then as you're reading. And the idea of the bucket is more about cocktail parties. Oh, how you haven't read Light in August? That's a shocking thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's almost for show. So I find it a fascinating question because archive, there is something almost inherently neurotic about the idea of an archive. You're clutching things to yourself. You know, the building starts to burn, and what book do you grab as you jump out the window? You know, it's something about saving something
Oh,
and
yeah.
binding these objects to yourself. And I say neurotic because it's about control. It's about keeping control somehow.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you don't keep control. You don't. You know, you leave the world as you entered it, right? With you can take nothing with you. And it amazes me as I've confronted mortality with people. My longtime tutor, Frank Kermode, died a few years ago.
Yeah.
I mentioned Robert Silvers
Yeah.
died. And you think of these people who have these incredibly cultivated minds, you
Yeah.
know, whose minds are a product of reading these thousands of books and talking to these thousands of people. And yet all of it at death is just the information just dissipates, you know?
No, it doesn't, Mark. I disagree. It lives on in your learning from him.
Well, yes.
That's how the reincarnation works. But I know what you're
No,
saying.
that's a beautiful notion.
Yeah, you can't call him up or email him and says, Robert, I forgot what you said about this. But
But
you
I
know,
can remember.
if you believe in that, but
Auden said of Yeats, he
yeah.
has become his admirers.
Oh my God.
He has become his admirers. And I always thought that was a singularly beautiful notion. He has become his admirers.
That is really good because this is I needed that one because this Joan Baez, they just made a doc on her and they go, you have any archives? And she goes, yeah, my mom saved everything. I've never opened the storage space in 50 years. So the documentarians they hit the holy grail, and then they're talking to her afterwards and they go, well, what are you going to do with all that stuff? And she goes, I don't care, throw it off the side of a mountain. And her assistant goes, oh, we're negotiating with the Smithsonian right now. And you know, and then George Lucas just opening the Museum of Narrative Art, like $1 billion, all the power to him. But same with Zappa. He's like, well, would you want to be remembered? He goes, no, that's what presidents want. I don't, you know, the legacy thing. So I appreciate that you went there because you are a historian. You know how it's important to have archives, to go to books. But if there were no books, it's like that whole idea of why don't we just live in the moment? Why do we even have to? So let's close out with this again. And this is something you said in part one, Mark. You see the artist's spirit. I love that you used that word. And this is Hollis Frampton, the great experimental filmmaker. A narrative is born among the animal necessities of the spirit because
That's
we're
wonderful.
because we're waiting to die.
Ah.
And he was a Wakean too. Okay, now.
Oh, you have to send me that quote.
I will send it to you. Will you, no, here's the question. Can you forget to die?
Can you forget to die?
Yeah.
Gosh, I hope so. That's a beautiful notion. I hope so. I think every moment we're forgetting to die. You know, every moment we live fully, we're forgetting to die,
Yeah.
which I think that vitality is about forgetting to die. I look at my mother's 96.
Yeah.
She's, every marble is still there. I call her, she's out. She's with some friend
Wow.
at 96. She still drives.
Oh my God.
It's like her life is a defeat of the forces of death. So I hope we can forget to die. I try to forget to die every day.
Well, there's no right or wrong answers to any of these questions, Mark, but that one you got really right, because most people, this is the question that perplex people the most. I go, can you forget to die? And they look at me and go, what do you mean? And they don't know it could be taken literally or metaphorically. And they go, well, you can't forget that you're going to die. Well, how do you know? I mean, Silvers didn't die. He lives on through you. But no, his body's gone. So I appreciate how you sussed it out, and you actually am, positive. And now I'll go back and I think maybe it's about 51% DNA. You got your brilliance from your mom and dad. That DNA, it seems to have leaked it. And, when I say to people, did you get that more from your parents or the way they raised you, their DNA, or on your own? And a lot of people think, well, I got it on my own. I didn't need my parents.
No,
it's like
I needed mine.
It's a pride question, So anyways, Mark, thank you so much. I really hope and beg we could do a part 3, maybe 5 or 6 months down the line.
My pleasure.
I thank you so much. It's been
I enjoy these discussions so much, Jerry. So I thank you.
Yeah, and it's really fun. And tell Truman I really loved his little jump-ins with the mask. It really added a surreal. My favorite art history movement was the surrealist and the Dadaist.
Well, Truman is a true Dadaist.
But then they always say, well, we formed our art movement because of the war. And I go, I don't want my favorite art movement to be formed because of the war. I hate that.
Yeah, I know. Think of it. Forget about the war. Think of it as Dada.
Yeah, it's called causality. That's the main thing McLuhan studied. That's what we're kind of always struggling with. Can anything cause anything? And we think it's all about causality, but it's way deeper.
Well, we think that way in retrospect.
Yes. Yeah.
We think, history, as Kierkegaard said, is lived forward but understood backward.
Oh, I love that one. That is so good. All right, Mark, thanks again. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Jerry. Do send me a link.
I will. And even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope this never ends and we keep talking forever and ever.
I look forward to it.